Welcome everyone to 1925 and the downfall of Reverend Earl Shaffner. Sunday morning recently dawned bright and pleasant in Hampton's Bay, Long Island, as the chimes of the Methodist Episcopal Church rang out their summons to morning service. The good people flocked in to hear the sermon of their pastor, the Reverend Earl Shaffner. His sermons were always so uplifting. The worthy deacons and overseers of the congregation and the members of the Ladies' Guild were present. Finally, everyone arrived and sat and waited for the service to begin. The organ kept on playing the processional. Soon everybody became uneasy. Two important people were conspicuously missing. The Reverend Shaffner, the pastor, was not there. His pulpit was empty, and over at the extreme left side of the platform, the seat usually occupied by Miss Georgia Ashe, charming young choir singer, was also unoccupied. The congregation began to ask themselves, "Where's the minister, and where's Miss Ashe?" Then came the sudden announcement. The Reverend had departed from town 3 days before, and he took his wife and his old father. The pastor had gone without saying goodbye to any of his flock. He had not secured a substitute to take his place. He had not told anyone he was going. Wednesday night, after the prayer meeting, he had intended to remain at Hampton Bays as long as he was pleasing to the people. Thursday morning, before noon, he had melted away. Why had he gone? What could be the explanation? Well, that's what we're going to discuss. Mr. Elmer Jackson, overseer of the church, local magnate, and uncle of Georgia Ashe, stepped forward and said, "The pastor went because I caught him out driving with my niece Georgia Ashe. The pastor is a married man. When we hired Reverend Shaffner, we believed he was all things the minister should be. Particularly, we believed we had brought into our town a man who would set an especially fine example to our young folks. What did he do instead? He took my niece out driving. He made love signs to her from the pulpit. He wrote her poetry, all about romance and moonshine. And then he went into the pulpit and he preached twice each Sabbath, such sermons that would melt your heart. And at the very same time, he was signaling my niece to meet him at Canoe Grounds, or go driving with him down Shore Road. Yes, he went, and he went sudden when Georgia's father and I found out. Next time, I'll be just as content with a pastor, less eloquent." The laymen of the church wondered in what possible way a pastor makes love from his pulpit, and how in the world Reverend Shaffner signaled his young parishioner words of admiration at the same time that he expounded his message. Miss Georgia Ashe herself, a very contrite and sorrowful young lady, explains how the pastor made love to her from October until the evening that Uncle Elmer interrupted their romantic ride down Canoe Road. Miss Georgia explains, "Pastor Shaffner came a year ago in April. He was fairly young, about 37, I guess, and he was awfully clever. And the new pastor was an outdoor man. He coached the high school baseball team. He played basketball with the high school boys too. But he hadn't been here long before some of the girls whispered things to me about him. One girl told me he had said to her, 'My dear, you're sweet enough to kiss.' Well," Georgia said, "I answered her back, 'Well, you better not try it.'" At this time, I had met the minister 3 or 4 times. Then came the midweek meeting. That evening, I returned to the church for a handkerchief I had dropped. I met the pastor coming out last of all. He said, "My dear young parishioner, the night is fine and nature is always alluring. I am hot and uplifted from my service. Wouldn't you come for a little air? A little ride in my car? You're looking pale." Of course, I was pleased, but I hesitated a moment. Then I remembered he was my pastor. He preached such nice sermons. Besides, he was the official example of conduct to all the young folks in East Hampton. If he thought it was all right for me to go riding with him, it must be all right. Oh, I told him, I adore nature too, and I will be pleased to come, Pastor. We went riding, and he recited to me long verses of different love poems, ending up with a song. The song was one almost everybody has heard, though it is hardly a classic. It's the one about, I loved her in the morning, I loved her at noon, but last night on the back porch I loved her best of all. Well, he hummed this, and he sighed, and he looked at me, and there was a great pale, languid moon over us. After that, things kept progressing. The pastor used to like me to go driving with him quite often. He said it rested his head and helped him to think up wonderful texts for next week's sermons, driving through the cool night air with an earnest young choir singer. When he told me this, I knew nothing could be wrong, and I felt that if I helped the pastor to preach good sermons by going with him, I was doing my share. Then one night he told me he was fond of me. He said he loved me, and that somehow, in some manner, things must take a turn so we could be happy. He gave me a poem which expressed this thought. It said, "It is the old, old story. Though it is true today, we'll be together, sweetheart. Love will find a way." He didn't put this in my hand. Instead, he signaled to me in the pulpit where I could find it hidden between the pages of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, 2 books of the Old Testament. I looked there and found the poem. I trembled. It seemed so romantic, love poems hidden away from me in the good book. But I must explain the pastor's pulpit signals to me. I thought him so clever when he told me about them. He said, when I put my left hand to my left ear, just for a moment, that means I love you. When I put my right hand to my right ear, that means look for a message in the usual place. If I take out my handkerchief, shake it, and stuff it into my right hip pocket, that means we will go driving down Shore Avenue that same evening. My hand suddenly raised to my mouth, and as suddenly dropped means, look out, the old tabby cats in the congregation are watching. And my hands lifted to each side of my breast, right where the top buttons of my coat are placed, means you are my little inspiration. Another one was, right arm over the pulpit meant be careful. Hand thrust through the hair means, will you go for a ride? Hand to the chin, I'll meet you at the usual place. And the hand to the left earlobe meant I love you. I like any kind of game, and this game of signals the pastor invented for us was far better than crossword puzzles. It was a beautiful new game, and only the pastor, whom everybody loved and looked up to, and I, little Georgia Ash, knew the right answer. It was positively thrilling. It was hard for me to get out every night, or even on so many nights as the pastor thought a ride in the cool air would do his head good and help his sermons. Of course, my people always liked to have me in early for the sake of my lessons, and the pastor told me his wife always questioned him closely as to where he was going. He used to tell her he was going to watch the after-supper basketball practice. That was a good way for him to get out. Well, we used to meet and go for a little ride, sometimes down Springville Avenue, sometimes to the Shore Road or Canoe Grounds. And very often he used to give me perfectly beautiful poetry which he had composed in my honor. I remember how the tears nearly came to my eyes when he recited this one. The rose is red, the violet blue, the world is sweet because of you. Of course, I knew the first two lines had been used with a different ending, but the sentiment was flattering to me. Then there was another one he recited 2 evenings later. It began, "A lady of old, one Queen Borgia, could never compare with my Georgia." Georgia being me, naturally. He got this far, then he slapped his hand on his coat. "Well, bless me," said the minister. "I thought that one up this afternoon, and now I plumb forgot how I ended it." I waited a long time for him to ask his memory, but he never remembered it. I was sorry. "Never mind," he said. "We better be returning home." And I felt sad that night. I think the minister felt sad too. Then, a few nights later, my uncle followed me. The pastor and I drove madly. The pastor's lips were set. His face was ashy white. "We've got to get away. They mustn't overtake us. They mustn't. It will ruin us both," the minister said. We drove in and out of country roads, down Main Street. We drove madly, desperately, the other car pressing us hard. At last it overtook us, and my Uncle Elmer Jackson was in the car. He pushed our car to the curb down by Canoe Grounds. My uncle stuck his head out of the window. "I'm Elmer Jackson," he said. That was all, but that was enough. So little Miss Ash tells the story, but events followed swiftly, both in the parsonage and later when the minister's car turned into the minister's house. Let me think," the pastor kept saying. And when the parsonage car finally reached the parsonage, Father Ash was waiting. A small man, but very tense. "You have till tomorrow noon to leave this town." All the neighbors say, Father Ash explained to the Reverend Mr. Shaffner. At any rate, at 11 o'clock the next morning, with a good hour's leeway till 12, the minister departed, saying goodbye to nobody, explaining to nobody. With one exception, he left a note to Uncle Elmer, who had interrupted the last ride. This is a note as Mr. Elmer Jackson gave it out. "I do not put any salutation on this, Elmer, because I'm afraid you would resent any I might attach. However, I have no unkind thought in my heart, only a great ache. How sorry I am, only God knows. How this will turn out depends upon my wife, and if it serves me right, she will give me up. If she does, I shall probably go to the devil. If she forgives me, I intend to try to be a better man in the future. There are some green peas and cabbages and eggs on the cellar stairs. You had best take them, and anything you find. I should appreciate any help you may render in keeping my record clean with the district superintendent. May I sign myself, An Awakened Fool." So the pastor wrote 3 days before the Sunday congregation assembled at the church when the pastor was missing. In the meantime, gossip seethed at Hampton Bays, and for every member of the congregation who is indignant, there are other members who feel that the pastor has had a very hard deal. One article tells an interesting story, and it goes like this. Georgia Ash's disillusionment cropped out in the most unsuspecting and disturbing fashion. One evening, following a very good sermon, peppily punctuated with profuse pantomime, Georgia was waiting outside the edifice. The Reverend Mr. Shaffner was due at any minute. Had he not indicated enough during the service with his signals? As she loitered impatiently, Miss Ash noticed that she was not alone in her vigil. Nearby, hiding in the shadows, were 2 other girls. "Waiting for someone?" Miss Ash queried pleasantly. "Oh, yes," they chorused. "We are waiting for the minister. He's to take us riding." Stifling whatever emotions may have been welling up within her, Miss Ash ventured to ask the pair how they could be certain he was coming. Their answer was a plexus punch in the ribs of romance. Why, he stroked his hair during the sermon, they affirmed. If their own words are any evidence, the code was known to many others in Hampton Bays besides Miss Ashe and the two rivals who disillusioned her. For example, Miss Virginia Earle, 18, and Miss Helen Smith, 16, told inquiring reporters, "Sure, we knew what the preacher's signals meant, but of course we never went riding with him." The Reverend Mr. Shaffner has left Hampton Bays. Miss Ashe is busy forgetting certain love lyrics that she once cherished. Those sentiments may be all very well for copybooks, but they don't square with Miss Ashe's ambitions. She's planning on going to nurses' training school so that she will be able to handle anyone who tries to emulate her late pulpiteering parson. The last the congregation ever heard of Reverend Shaffner was that he moved to Ohio, and we'll never know if he ever lived down the nickname the Wig-Wag Minister. These articles were all over the country. I hope you enjoyed this story. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more. Bye.